questions left over from did any of you hear what I was talking about before? Do you have any questions as a result of that? Right. Oh, can you repeat the question? Yeah, I will, sure. The question was that I spoke, most of you weren't there, I can tell by looking at you. I memorized the faces of everybody in the audience. She asked, she said, I said something about, I was talking about the allocation of resources in the United States. Can you all hear me, by the way? No. Yeah, up there. You can. You want me to use the mic?
Yes.
All right.
I love
Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah, is there anybody who can't hear me? Okay. I said something in my talk a little while ago about the waste of resources in the United States. And I was talking about two sources of that waste. And that's what the question was about, I think, that one of them was the waste of resources that goes into military spending, about $2 trillion that had been spent, $2,000 billion spent for military since World War II. And the other was the waste that goes into the production of unnecessary luxury things in a society when necessities are not funded. And I was talking about the fact that in housing, for instance, the money for housing, the money for buildings goes into the construction of financial centers and insurance. You know, you look in my city of Boston, I call it my city, it belongs to me. The city of Boston, you know, the huge towers of steel and concrete for insurance companies and businesses, and while the people in South Boston, East Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester are living in the most terrible places. There's no money to rebuild just ordinary housing for people, but there's money for that. And I was using that as an example of the fact that the huge sums of money being spent in our very rich society for things that are not absolutely necessary when there are real necessities of medical care and housing, child care, care for old people, solving a problem, you know, cleaning up the rivers and the air and so on, which are just not being addressed. So it's that second thing. So now the rest of you are wondering, what in the world was that talk about? Or maybe you aren't wondering at all, which would be worse. But I haven't prepared a lecture for today. Very few teachers will confess this to you. But no, I have not prepared. And that's why we were talking as we were, this is how much preparation it was. We were talking on our way over here about what I should talk about. But starting with last night over a few beers, we were talking about what you do in this class, and I know that science is a kind of theme and values and so on. So I thought that maybe I would talk about you think I don't know. You think I'm grasping for something, hoping to invent something on the moment that I will talk about. No. Talk about careers. What you do in life, or what your work is, and how you adjust the problem of, and how you connect the problem of finding a career, finding a thing to do in life, being a this or a that, being a teacher or a scientist or an artist or a manager or whatever, being something because everybody has to be something. Everybody has to have a field, or people won't talk to you. And so, how do you connect that with being a person who does something about what is wrong in the world? That is, having values that go beyond the values of immediate security and success and survival. My assumption is that we need to go beyond that, because if people are only concerned with their personal survival and the survival of their families, then they won't survive. There used to be a time in history, maybe up to yesterday, you see, when it was possible for people to survive themselves and their families, and to hell with everybody else. It doesn't matter, you can still make it. The world is too interdependent now. We're poised too delicately on the edge of nuclear war, of economic disaster, of ecological catastrophe. We're too close to all of that. And all of those things impinge not just on the poor and the unsuccessful, they impinge on everybody. If the air we breathe is no longer breathable, it doesn't matter if you're a successful lawyer. You still will not find a beach to go to. What will you do? Going to work, wear a mask, so you can then get back to the suburbs and breathe fresh air. We reached that point in history where we had better do something about the things that are happening in the world. And I don't want to say even only for selfish reasons. The reason should go beyond that. But what I'm saying is that at this point, it even includes selfish reasons. It's not just a luxury to be concerned about what's happening in the world. It's a necessity. When I say it's a necessity for ourselves and for others, I don't mean to draw a clean line between doing something in the world for yourself and doing something for others, because doing something for others is not just an act of nobility. It has something to do with your own success in your own mind as a human being, aside from the success you have in your job. I don't know if that's clear, but we on platforms have never been concerned about how clear we are. We guess. I was thinking about your theme of science. I was thinking about professionalism, thinking about careers, thinking about what you do in life, and thinking about how, especially among professionals, there's a tendency to separate the efficiency with which you do your job and the success with which you pursue your career. There's a tendency to separate that from your values and concerns as a human being for other human beings on the planet. I was thinking of science, perhaps the most obvious example that comes to mind. I was thinking of the scientists who are connected with the building of atomic bombs, and thinking how careerism could get in the way of a careful humanist consideration for the consequences of a bomb, and how professionalism, how the desire to be good in your field, and how total concentration on your field and your work could obliterate the world outside. Well, you can see it more clearly with somebody like Wernher von Braun. How many of you know the name Wernher von Braun? Few. Well, I don't blame the rest of you for not knowing him. He's a post-World War, he's a World War II and post. He worked for the Nazis. That's a good job. Well paid. He worked for the Nazis building rockets, which exploded in London and other districts where people lived. Bad man? Oh, just a good scientist. Right? Not just doing his job. When the war ended, the United States Army intelligence rushed to pick up Werner von Braun, who had built the rockets that killed a lot of people, and bring them over to the United States where he could build rockets for us to kill other kinds of people. Didn't matter to Werner von Braun who he worked for, or who he built rockets for. He was just concerned with building good rockets. There are people like that. There are lawyers like that, there are doctors like that, there are teachers. I shouldn't say that. No, there are people in every field like that. There are people so concerned that I want to, the consequences of what I do are something else. I just want to be good at what I'm doing. There was an unfortunate little tendency like that in the recent presidential campaign where Dukakis at one point, I don't know if you remember that, said, look, he said, I'm not concerned with ideology. Do you remember that? I remember that. Maybe because he's the governor of Massachusetts, and I'm from Massachusetts, and if you're from Massachusetts, you have to memorize everything that the governor says. But Dukakis said, in talking about his contest of Bush, I don't want to deal with ideology. Let's not talk about highfalutin questions of right and wrong and this now. Let's talk about who will do a better job. Who will be more efficient? Wow. Job of what? Efficient at what? Where is this going to lead to? Who do you care about? What are the consequences of this? No, I'm going to be good at what I'm doing. When Oppenheimer, right, the man who was in charge of the scientific work that went into the making of the atomic bomb, was shown a certain formula for the building of a bomb that could kill a huge number of people. He said, I don't like the idea, but it's technically sweet. Technically sweet. And in fact, so many of these scientists were so overcome with the beauty, the technical beauty of what they had done, that the human consequences were, it's not that they didn't think about them, but they didn't seem to have first priority. And Oppenheimer, when he was on the little group of scientists that were advising the committee, something called the interim committee that was set up under Stimson in 1945, when they were deciding what to do with the first atomic bombs that we had manufactured, right? War in Europe was over, the war in Japan was still on, and although Japan was on the verge of surrender and their negotiators were negotiating in Moscow to talk about surrender terms, we had built the bombs, and a lot of people were determined to use them. And this committee was trying to decide, well, what should we do with the bomb? Should we drop it in a Japanese city? There was an alternative. Could wait for the Japanese to surrender, which they seemed to be on the verge of doing. You didn't have to rush into killing 100,000 people in Hiroshima. I know Truman called it a military target, but Truman was not one of our brightest or most moral. The Japs. Really? We are at war. Who cares? Women, children, old people, they're all Japs. Gotta win the war, get them. Just, we're number one, and all of that. So Oppenheimer was on this committee, scientific committee, and they voted to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. Not a military target, just people in. If any of you have ever seen pictures of or read stories or read accounts of the people who were in Hiroshima at the time, and you would think that when the Nazis first dropped bombs on civilians and cities at the beginning of World War II, how horrified we were. How we said, this is savagery, this is barbarism, this is not war. Killing, dropping bombs indiscriminately on a city and killing whoever there is. And sure, the Nazis are just like that. And then we did it on an even larger scale than the Nazis had done it. We did. And Oppenheimer went along. This brilliant man. And the super scientist. When they asked him later about it, he said, well, what do I know about politics? I'm just a scientist. You mean you think that those people who are up there in the White House and et cetera, you think they know about politics? Because you think they know about politics in the deepest sense, as they know right and wrong? You think you can leave it to them? You think you as a scientist don't have the brains or the humanity to interpose your opinion in a discussion and say what you think is right or wrong? You're going to be like you, the super scientist, the super brain, are going to be like all the rest of the American people who say, well, what do we know? Our leaders, we trust them. We trust Nixon. We trust, we trust all these guys. They know best. I mean, why are they up there? It's a definition, right? Anybody who's up there knows best. That's why he's up there. Really? History should have taught us something like that. You've got a long history of people who are up there and who have sent whole nations into devastation because of their decisions, including our own. So, here's a scientist abdicating his responsibility as a human being. Well, or Edward Teller. My job, I'm just doing my job. So, I thought about that. Well, I just flashed on the fact that I was once in the Air Force. I try to forget it, but it keeps coming back to me. I was once in the Air Force, and I used to drop bombs. I was a bombardier in the Air Force, and I dropped bombs on people. And I was just doing my job. I wanted to be good at what I was doing. And I also had some vague notion that somewhere there was right and wrong. I was on the right side, the other side was the wrong side. And since I knew, this is how intelligent I was, my logic consisted of two sentences. One, they're wrong and we're right. Two, therefore anything goes. It was only after I had done things like that that I began to think about that and wonder how many people just do their jobs. I actually could understand the Nazis who said, look, oh yeah, death camps and so on. Oh yeah, no, I was just doing my job. Or the soldiers in Vietnam who committed massacres, or people anywhere who committed massacres. People, human beings, these are not extraordinary human beings. People who commit atrocities are not different. They're just all of us when we become obedient servants of a machine and we think all we have to do is do our job well and not ask the big questions. We don't want to embarrass ourselves. We don't want to stick out. We don't want to get into trouble. We don't want to look like kooks, right? I could never dream, right, when I was being briefed to go on a mission to drop the first napalm bombs on a French city when the war was just about over and there was no need to drop any bombs at all. And it never occurred to me that I could stand up in the midst of the intelligence briefing and say, hey, why are we doing this? It never occurred to me. And think of how often it never occurs to us. It takes too much nerve to step out of line, to get into trouble, to have people look at us. And yet that's exactly what has to be done more and more in our lives. Fortunately, there are people who have done it. And in our time in the United States, we've seen more and more instances of courageous people who step out of line. But that's the most interesting thing. It's nice to see in the Soviet Union, dissenters, people will step out of line. They're taking big risks to do it. And in the United States, Daniel Ellsberg took the chance of going to prison for 100 years. I like these sentences of 100 years. very optimistic about longevity. And took the chance in order to secretly print these documents on the Vietnam War that would get out to the American public and educate the public about the Vietnam War. Well, these ex-CIA agents who now testify about what they did while they were in the CIA, whistleblowers, they call them. People, or the attorneys here in Arizona, I was just thinking about that. I don't know why Arizona stuck in my mind. But the attorneys here in Arizona who wouldn't go along with the prosecuting attorney who wanted to prosecute the people who gave sanctuary to the refugees from Central America. Remember that case? Remember that big case here in Phoenix? They prosecuted these people who were giving sanctuary to illegal immigrants who were coming from countries where death squads existed and where these people were in danger, and they were prosecuted but they took a poll among attorneys in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Phoenix, Tucson area, and all of the attorneys but 2 said we shouldn't go ahead with the prosecution. But those 2 were the bosses. So, majority rules. Anyway, I thought about when I went into teaching and became a teacher and history, stuff like that. I guess I thought about that. I thought about being a professional, being a teacher, and I thought about the sort of tradition of, it seemed to me there was a tradition of, oh, you're a teacher, you should be neutral, right? I remember having teachers who you never knew what they were thinking, right? You never knew what stand, how they felt about the issues. I'm sorry, I'm the teacher, here it is, I'm just presenting you with the information, and you can do with it what you will, and so on. I could never do that. I knew I could never do that. I could never be a teacher like that. I knew I had to present, well, sure, I have to tell people honestly, these are my ideas, these are my beliefs, this is not the gospel. I would like it to be the gospel, but it's not really the gospel. But I have to tell you what I think, otherwise, what am I? A neutral conveyor of whatever information happens to be presented in the books that you are reading? And of course, that claim of neutrality is false anyway. The teacher says, look, here are these materials, I'm not taking a stand on it, is taking a stand. Right? No sense, so you can't be neutral in a world which is already going in a certain direction. You can't be neutral on a moving train. The world is already moving in certain directions. Forces that are already in power, and there are other forces that are powerless. It's not a neutral world, and therefore to be presumably neutral in this world is to accept things as they are. And besides, to simply present people with material and say, I'm presenting you with neutral material is a deception. Because what you present to people is already a statement, right? The facts that you select, the readings that you select, the information that you pick out of this infinite mass of information in the world, the information you pick out and you give to people, you say, look, I'm neutral. What you've selected already says where you stand and already moves in a certain direction. So there's no escaping taking a stand, whether you admit to it or not. So I guess I'm trying to grapple with you and with me with this question of how do you be a professional, do your job, and be, make a living for yourself and your family, etc., and yet not surrender what is happening in the world to those people who make decisions. I'm not suggesting we all have to drop whatever we're doing to prepare ourselves for some career, become martyrs and live in, dressed in loincloths and eat vegetables and just do good things in the world. Very few people can do that. people have, you're part of society and your culture, and you have to be in that culture, and you have to survive, and it's okay to have television and a car and so on. But surely there's some part of your life and some part of your thinking which seems you must always be concerned with something beyond that in order to make whatever you're doing more important to you, to make it really important to you. Because otherwise, it doesn't matter how successful you are, it doesn't matter how rich you are, it's a very paltry kind of success. So I think that's all I'm going to say at this moment. You may suspect that's all I have to say, but that's all I will say. And you can, any questions, comments, reactions on any subject? You can change the subject if you want. Yes.
At what age did you have this humanistic revelation?
At what age did I have this humanistic revelation? I feel like I'm in AA. It's a good question. It's just that I can't answer it exactly. I don't know. I'd like to say that well, I don't know. I don't know, because as I said, I was in the Air Force and I was doing these things, and I wasn't, things I wasn't thinking about. But I think I'm trying to think of things that affected me. I think being in that war affected me, because at the end of the war, as enthusiastic as a bombardier as I was, really gung ho. I wanted, but when the war ended, and I gathered my little mementos and little folder, my photos and my old navigation logs and stuff like that. I wrote on the folder, "Never again." This to the best of wars, right? A good war, and so on. But so it must have started. Something started me thinking about war at that point. And then I think a very important influence in my life was teaching in the South. And my first teaching job was teaching at a small black college in Atlanta, Georgia, Spelman College, a women's college, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. I became involved in the Civil Rights Movement, and I learned a heck of a lot more by teaching at that little college with this low rating, like way down at the bottom, and I learned far more teaching there than I would have if I were teaching at the same time at Harvard University.
Well, what I'm curious of is, what were some of the organizations that you got involved with to channel this intrinsic need for humanistic?
Organizations that I got involved with.
Or other than, you're talking right now for humanistic awareness.
Sure.
Do you have any nonprofit organizations or ecological organizations that you have joined or been part of?
Today? Oh, you may talk about today.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are. I don't know what there is in Phoenix. I assume there are. Probably the people here will tell you. I know that in the country now there are thousands of organizations working on very important social issues. I can tell you what's in the Boston area, and you can find out from people here where there are comparable things in the Phoenix area.
I'm aware of them. I was just curious which ones you were involved with.
Well, the Pledge of Resistance. I'm involved with the Pledge of Resistance. How many of you have ever heard of the Pledge of Resistance? It's obviously a secret organization. The Pledge of Resistance consists of about 60,000 people around the country who have signed a pledge against American military intervention in Nicaragua. We believe the United States should not invade Nicaragua and try to under the guise of saving America and so on. And so we've signed pledges pledging that we would resist this, that we would, if necessary, commit civil disobedience, we would do the kinds of things that people did in the civil rights movement or in the anti-war movement to create a protest against this. I'm involved with somewhat with Greenpeace, which which is an environmental group around the country, which does a lot of good things. I was involved in the anti-nuclear movement against Seabrook, which is this nuclear plant in New Hampshire. There's an instance of a kind of victory. There's the Seabrook nuclear plant, because there's been so much opposition by people in the vicinity and people all around the area to this nuclear plant, which if anything, if there's an accident there, like a 3 Mile Island, there's no place for people to go. No way people can escape. Huge casualties would ensue. And anyway, and the plant has not been able to, operation of the plant has been delayed for years and years and years because of the protesting. So, I don't want to claim too much for my own activity. I was involved, I'm probably not as active now as I was in the civil rights movement when I was connected with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, or during the anti-war movement when I was very, very much involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam. But there are lots of organizations, anti-arms organizations, movements against the militarization, against the arms race, all over the country, and I assume in Phoenix also. Yes.
Well, when you talk about humanistic concern, I'm thinking more towards organizations that are nonprofit and that are helping within the community. Because I tend to disagree with some of the militaristic approaches that these groups that you're involved with have been taking as in movements against instead of movements for some kind of. For instance, I'm involved with the JCs. Last summer, I spent most of my summers doing work for projects here in town. Instead of movements against, we're addressing problems. We're going out and we're feeding people, we're picking up litter, and we're not really protesting.
That's good.
Well, I just kind of.
Yeah, I think both are necessary. I think both are necessary. I think you need movements to protest against bad things that are done. At the same time, you have to show examples, and you have to help people immediately. And I think the sanctuary movement was a positive movement. It's not just a protest movement. The sanctuary movement gave positive help to people who were in need, refugees who were in danger. I think that's a positive movement. And people who are trying to get more money allocated by the legislature for schools or for community colleges or for anybody who's trying to get more money so that they can have a daycare center at the community college. They're doing something positive and good. I think both are necessary. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
As I understand it, you're asking us to step out of our micro self, of our micro viewpoint, take more of a macro view of our position in our society, and take some responsibility of having this more macro view. What do you suggest to the individual who does this? Is how to survive in a society or in a world that does hold such a micro view of everything. How is a person to carry on holding the macro view and trying to be responsible to that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Do you hear her question? Well, she's saying, well, how? I'm talking about having she called it a macro view, or sort of a view of the larger problems of society, while taking care of your personal micro problems of survival. And she's asking, well, how can you do both? Don't you run into trouble, right?
Well, not in doing both, but in being an individual who takes the responsibility of the macro view, who takes it personally, and who sees it as something that is important. There is often a lot of pressure, a lot of, I hate to say, people who hold the macro view are not accepted. They are put under pressure to not hold that macro view. And I'm asking you, how do you suggest an individual, from your own personal, how do you survive and still maintain that macro view in a society that is so micro?
Right. Talking about the pressures on you from society, the pressures on you when you're trying to enlarge your view and do other things. The pressures against that. There are risks that you take. You may risk your job, right? Or if you're a lawyer and you want to not to just take cases for corporations, you want to take cases against corporations. If you want to take do legal work for poor people and so on, you're taking risks. You risk your economic survival. I mean, I know a labor lawyer in the Midwest who lost his job with his labor law firm because he took a stand that was a little too far out for them. Teachers in the academic world, teachers who take stands that offend the administration will not get tenure. That certainly happens at my university, Boston University. And it happens at colleges and universities all over the country. And universities, of course, are supposed to be the most tolerant and liberal and centers of free inquiry and so on. But of course, you're perfectly right. In every situation, if you're working for a GE, if you're working for a big corporation, or you point out defects in what they're doing, you're in danger. Your economic survival is at stake. So, what do you do? The answer to that is difficult because you can say, well, do nothing, right? Retreat and save yourself. No, you have to take risks. You have to be willing to risk your job. You have to think about people who risk their lives or risk their freedom. You have to think of the social movements in which people went to prison and risked a lot, and think that risking your job is not the most terrible thing in the world. Being fired is not the end of your life. It's tough and it's hard. And now I say that, but at the same time, along with that, there's also a kind of, and I don't know how to say this, a kind of compromise with the real world that you have to make. That is, if you're a person of total principles, right? Totally going to live your life according to your principles, you're going to isolate yourself from the world. And so you have this very delicate problem of how to maintain your contact with the real world and yet be willing to take risks.
So what you're saying is a matter of learning to work with the system, yet still maintaining your ideals.
Learning to work the system, maintain your ideals, but even be prepared to be expelled from the system if it comes to that point. So look, I was talking before about Ellsberg, and right, he's working for the Rand Corporation, and might say, oh, continue working for the Rand Corporation, right, and do your thing, but a point is reached where he's not going to be able to do both, so he's going to lose his job, and maybe even be prosecuted, but he feels he has to do it, and there are people, so it's a kind of little guerrilla warfare you are waging with the system. And one part of an answer is that it helps not to do it alone. It helps to be part of an organization, of a group. Individuals are very, very vulnerable to a mammoth system which can destroy individuals very easily. So everybody needs some support. And if it's good to become part of some group that thinks the way you do and wants to do the same thing as you do, and sometimes a group can defend itself. Often a group can defend itself certainly more easily than an individual can.
Do you still encourage that as
Individuals do.
That as an individual we do uphold a more macro view?
Oh yeah, I think we have to with all the risks, with all the risks involved. If you're not living with that kind of a risk, you probably aren't doing as much as you should be doing, and it's a problem how to move to the edge of risk without committing suicide. There are very self-sacrificial people who you admire. They've given their whole lives and they're willing to spend 10 years in jail. Well, maybe I'm not willing to spend 10 years in jail. I know people who are. I may be willing to spend 30 days in jail. We all have our limits, right? Some people may not want to spend one day in jail, but they're willing to do something else, you see. But each of us has to make decisions ourselves, but to push ourselves as far as we can. But I believe this, just looking at things historically, historians always claim they have a big perspective. I've looked at things historically, and therefore I know, and so on. But with that warning, I say, it seems to me that when great things have been accomplished by social movements, like the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement, they've been accomplished not on the basis of everybody doing heroic, suicidal things. They've been accomplished on the basis of very tiny things done by a huge number of people. If you have very small things done by a huge number of people, it's more effective than very heroic things done by a handful of people. People engaged in terrorism are people who are desperate to accomplish something. With a handful of people. But the people who organize can have a nonviolence movement which accomplishes things.
With that thought, I think we would like to move on to